Erica's going to talk about intellectual property, and Rupa is going to talk about project management. The first session last month was focused on the TPP itself, and then next month the focus is on entrepreneurship and company formation. And so I'll just briefly mention that Erica was an undergrad at MIT, then she got a PhD in molecular biology at UC Berkeley, went to work in the pharma industry for many, many years, and then decided she was fascinated with intellectual property. And so she went back to law school, became an attorney, went to work for went to work for DLA Piper, and now has her own practice. She's got a practice. Her practice is focused on intellectual property with a focus on startups coming out of academia in particular. And so to say it for the second time, we're really lucky that Erica is with us today. She gives a great talk on intellectual property. Rupa, with the Catalyst program and the Invent Fund at UCSF, went to the IIT and then got her PhD at Caltech in Pasadena, did postdocs in up in University of Washington, and worked for Bayer for many years, and has been at UCSF now almost 5 years, where she's the senior associate director of both the Catalyst program and the Invent Fund. And Rupa has studied project management. It's project management with a capital P and a capital M, the formal discipline of project management, and holds both a certificate from Berkeley and as well is chartered by the Project Management Professional Association. So we're also really lucky that Rupa is speaking to us today. And unless there's any initial questions, I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
All right, thanks, Charles. I'm gonna tell you just a few things about me, and then we'll walk through some slides together. And I'm gonna encourage people to ask questions as I go along. You're just gonna have to pipe up and don't do the like fake hand thing because I won't see it. Just interrupt me. That's totally cool.
Erica, let me interrupt. You can go ahead and type the question into the chat or the Q&A because Nate is gonna monitor it on Erica's behalf. So you can either interrupt if you want, which is fine, or you can type it in those two fields and Nate's gonna monitor. Thanks, Erica.
Sure. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about intellectual property, and I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about what I do, because as Charles said, I work with a lot of companies that spin out of universities, from anything from undergrad to graduate student, postdoc, professor projects, or are just founders who pick up research from universities and license it and then use that to start their company. And one of the interesting things is how they go about figuring out how to protect those innovations and improve upon them. So I don't have a good sense about how much intellectual property information you bump into in your background. So we'll just sort of walk through this and talk about it and see where we get. So IP, right, is intellectual property. And I say this because I went to a cocktail party once, actually, when I had first started Ingensity IP, which is my business. And I was telling someone what I did. And, you know, we're standing next to the food table, which I guess none of us have done for like the last year and a half. And I'm talking about IP, and the guy's just kind of nodding, looking really confused. And I realized he's a computer scientist, and IP stands for something totally different in computers, right? Like IP address. Guy was like totally at a loss for what I do. So just so we're all on the same page, we're going to talk about the IP that's intellectual property today. And we're going to talk about it in a sense of, you know, when you have an innovation, whether it's kind of a basic research thing, or you have figured out how to cure cancer, how do you go about protecting that, right? And a lot of people think about patents, but there's also trade secrets, trademarks, there's copyright. In the life sciences, which is the area that I primarily work in, particularly for therapeutics, there's a lot of regulatory exclusivities. And in other life sciences, like the food science area, there's a fair number of regulatory barriers to entry that can give you a competitive edge. And then there are just commercial protections, like being the first to market or having a service-based differentiation of why you do what you do better than anyone else. And we're not going to talk about those latter stuff today. We are going to primarily talk about patents, just because it probably will be the type of IP you will run across that will relate to your TPP, but I'll try to touch on a little bit about trade secrets, because for those of you who are working with groups that are focused on processes or methods, sometimes, or manufacturing aspects, trade secrets can be just as powerful, sometimes more powerful than patents. Okay, so basically IP strategy is, which is what I advise companies on, particularly most of the companies I work with, like I said, are just spinning out of like a university. So they're pre-seed stage, meaning they haven't really gotten funded at all, or they have a little funding from friends or family or a grant, up to about Series C, right? And you're going to hear probably from, I think James Huey is talking to you next week about what hopefully those different series mean, but those are just rounds of funding that founders get. And by the time they kind of get along, it goes in alphabetical order, they grow bigger and they have more to protect. And so the question becomes, can you protect what you have, and how, and when can you do that? And then the other thing is, do you have a clear path to market? Does someone else's intellectual property get in your way, right, and act as a barrier? And if it does, can you figure out a way to drive around it? Or are you really just going to crash headlong into it, and you're going to have to come to a resolution with that other party? And these are questions that startups get asked all the time, right? So from their very first formation, there is really is the question of, you know, for example, I'll give you a real common problem in academia. Academics, particularly professors, right, their whole career is premised on publication, right? It's that publish or perish type of thing. So if you go out there and you publish something, as we'll talk about a little later, you can't patent it, right? Because you've already kind of dedicated it to the world. You've put it out there for public use. And that what often happens with academic researchers is they publish because that's what they're supposed to be doing. And then 3 or 4 years down the road, they want to form a company and they want to file a patent, but they've already published on a chunk of that research. And they need to figure out, well, what do I do about that, right? How do I still protect what I have? And then the flip side of that gets asked a lot is, you know, what happens if you decide you're going to work on something that other people work on? For example, if I'm sitting here today and I want to make an antibody against PD-1, I am going to smack up against a bunch of PD-1 antibodies that are commercially used in the clinic today and have IP around them. And I'm going to have to figure out, do the patents that cover those antibodies cover my antibody, or am I free to go forward? All right. So one thing I do want to tell you and make certain, this is just my own approach to this, is while IP is super important and it's a very valuable asset, but sometimes the only asset besides the people of a startup company when you first start, right? Because you're not making a product, it really shouldn't be the tail that wags the dog. And what I mean by that is IP should not be the thing that drives your company strategy. Your intellectual property strategy should support your business strategy, right? Because at the end of the day, hopefully your whole purpose in going into a company is to make a product or a service, right? And if you're in, for example, healthcare, it's often to help patients. Or if you're in food sciences, it's, you know, perhaps to make a better, healthier food, or medical device to make an improvement, for example, to someone's heart monitor or a new diagnostic test. And those are the goals that should drive the company and how you get there, not just, you know, I'm going to file 10 patents this year. And while that may sound silly, I've actually seen articles where people are like, you should be filing, you know, 10 patents per year. And that's kind of a silly way of driving things. So a lot of startup IP strategy is about the value proposition that the company has. Where is the company headed? What is its end goals? What is it trying to do? And then figuring out how different things like patents, trade secrets, trademarks, and such can support that value proposition that the company has come up with. And one of the big questions I think that you should think about, particularly when you're dealing with these TPPs, and I'll pause here because I've worked with a number of the catalyst companies, really enjoyed seeing, some of them are companies and some of them are researchers that are going to stay in the university, is really think about what is the plan, right? Not everyone wants to jump off the university ship and form a company for many different reasons. First of all, the university is a great place to be, right? Does great research. A lot of people are, particularly in the Catalyst program, are also practicing physicians or other healthcare workers. And so they may not ever want to leave that part of their job to form a company. Some people want to do both, and some people do want to form a company. And so figuring out what the group wants to do with the technology is part of figuring out how to protect it and how to drive that strategy. So, for example, one alternative to forming a startup company is to work on the technology for sufficient amount of time that it becomes very attractive to another player. And that other player could be big pharma, like a GSK or a Bayer or, a Moderna. I guess they're not so big, but they're certainly in the news these days. Or it could be, handing it off to another small startup and just licensing out the technology to someone. We talked about forming a startup, and then there are some people who kind of live that hybrid life. I have one client who is with the UC system, and she's running 4 clinical trials, and she's still sitting as a professor in the university and also has this small startup. So you kind of get the whole blend. And the reason that becomes important is because if you're going to become a company, you need to plan for how the company will own things and how it will run things. And, that may be things I can't speak for Rupert, but she may speak a little bit about how those projects, get organized and run. Whereas if you're going to stay with the university, you may be planning, IP for what is going to be attractive to your partner. For example, if I'm going to partner with a company that's located in Argentina, that company is probably interested in seeing intellectual property protection in Argentina. Whereas if I'm going to partner with a company that's only based in the US, they might not care about, for example, getting patent rights in South America. Thus the questions here. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about patents. So patents are, what's generally often associated with the term intellectual property, and they are very useful. One of the things to remember is they are a fence, right? They fence off your technology from other people's use. So it's like kind of putting up a fence around your yard and saying, keep out, right? This is my sandbox. They do not give you what some people will call freedom to operate. So just because I have a patent does not mean I can do everything that's in the patent, right? Because someone else may have overlapping rights. We're not going to get into that really today, but it is a concept I like to put out there because it's a really common misconception among pretty much everyone, including investors. The other thing to remember is that patents are country specific. So if I file a patent in the US, I protect my technology in the US. If I want to protect my technology in France, I'm going to have to get a patent in France. If I want to protect it in China or Macau, I'm going to have to get a patent there. And that becomes important because patents are expensive and they get expensive quickly. And so companies or founders of technology have to decide pretty early on where they're going to file. And we'll talk a little bit about what the timeline looks like for that, but it is something to think about. The other thing is that generally patents last for 20 years. So you get a filing date, and 20 years from that filing date, your patent expires. Your patent may not grant for 5 years. So of those 20 years, right, you only have 15 years left where you have this granted patent. After the 20 years, that technology is free for everyone to use, right? That's the kind of what they call the quid pro quo. You get a 20-year monopoly. When that 20 years ends, the public has the right to use that technology for free. For most of what you'll deal with, that shouldn't be an issue, right? Because you're probably dealing with a lot of companies or groups of researchers whose technology is pretty recent, and they may have just filed a patent application, or they haven't even filed one yet, and they're thinking about doing it. But this does come up. I have had startups I had one startup who started and they wanted to license technology, and the patent had already run 15 years. So there's only 5 years left, and it was a therapeutic. So it's going to take them 10 years really to pretty much make the product, get through the regulatory clinical trials, and get on the market. Well, you can see how that timeline might not work out so well, right? Because the patent would expire 5 years from the company after the company got it, and they'd still have 5 years to go before they put a product on the market. And so part of the strategy is figuring out what other protections, what other new patents could they file that might protect their product given the older IP. Okay. Next topic, what can you patent? So you pretty much can patent a lot of things in the life sciences, and they fall into two groups. One is products. Products are tangible things like a drug, a chemical, a medical device, a component of a medical device. You can also patent methods. So methods might be a diagnostic method, for example, diagnosing COVID, or a method of treatment, treating a cancer patient with a particular type of drug. There are methods that are a little more abstract, that are more closer to the bioinformatics, artificial intelligence, and there are some challenges in patenting those types of methods, but it is possible. There are challenges in patenting certain products. For example, you can't patent a natural product. If I, for example, go into the soil and I pull out a particular bacterial species from nature and I do nothing else but just pull it out of nature, you can't patent that, right? Because the Supreme Court said, hey, that's a piece of nature. You can't just claim it as yours. So I kind of put together some examples for drugs, just because they tend to be relevant for a number of the ideas and that researchers are working on at UCSF and some of the other universities that are involved in this program. So let's talk about for a drug, right? You'd have an active ingredient, like the chemical structure for the drug, or if it's a biologic, like the antibody structure, the antibody sequence. A formulation, right? So we don't deliver drugs just in water, right? For example, antibodies are often formulated in surfactants and other stabilizers so that they don't aggregate and they can enter your bloodstream easily. And so you can patent that. You can patent methods of making the drug and its formulation. And I'm going to stop here because here's one of the areas where trade secret can be really valuable, and you might not want to patent. Say you were the only one who knew how to make a particular chemical compound, right? And you made it a very special way. Maybe other people could make it, but it was highly inefficient the way they would make it. You could make it really well, which means you could make it to scale and manufacture it. If you patent it, right, that means the patent, as we'll talk about, publishes and people can read about that method. Then everyone else could sort of copy it. Now they're not supposed to, right, because you have this patent, but how are you going to know, right? Are you going to climb in the factory window and see what they're doing, right? You're kind of stuck. So sometimes methods that you can't tell whether people are using or not because they're done behind closed doors make better trade secrets. Other things we talked about, methods of treating and delivering drugs. And then of course you can patent combinations of drugs and devices and combinations of drugs. Okay, before I go into sort of starting to talk about what a patent looks like, because some of you might run into these when you're working with your groups, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask?
Got a question, Erica.
Sure.
I've been trying to read more about this subject, and I've come across the concept of exclusivities, like drug exclusivities. Can you define that a little bit, because I get confused about how can they be combined?
Sure. So drug exclusivities are actually if we go back, let me see if I can go backwards. I'm not very good at this. So let's see if we go back to this list, right? Our part of what's on this list is regulatory exclusivities. So in the US, we'll talk about the US first, but Europe has a similar system. When you go to the FDA and you are the first person to get approval for a drug, and so let's just take Humira, right, which is an antibody. You are the first one to get approval from the FDA that you can market that antibody as safe and effective. You get a certain amount of years of exclusivity, but that's not based on patents. It's actually based on the Food and Drug Administration. And the exclusivity is the fact there's two types. One is what's called data exclusivity, which means that the data that you submit to the FDA is not accessible to other companies like generic companies for a certain amount of time. And then there's also an exclusivity that says that the FDA is not going to actually approve another product that's the same as yours or similar enough for a certain number of years. And so in the US, for small molecules, generics can't come in for 5 years, and biosimilars, which is on the biologic side, can't come in for 12. But those they don't necessarily have to have patents, and you can have both regulatory exclusivities and then also have patents that would cover your drug for a longer time than what the FDA exclusivity would give you.
And if a drug that already exists and it's been approved to treat X disease, I discover I can use it to try to treat a different disease. Can I get exclusivity on that?
There is FDA exclusivity for a shorter period for small molecules for new indications. And there are certain rules about that I am not as familiar with, but could certainly look up. But yes, in some cases, the answer is yes. In some cases, the answer is no. So it's kind of a gray area. Certainly on a patent situation, if it's not obvious that you could, no one had treated your second disease, whatever it is, that's different from what the drug used to be used for, then it makes good grounds for patent coverage as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
Hi, Erica.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for doing this talk. I have a question about trade secrets and how they oftentimes don't get included into patents, so to keep it a secret and you don't have to publish it. My question about trade secrets are that what's the enforcement on trade secrets? Because from what I understand, a patent is the government will enforce it if you use the technology without the proper permissions, without proper licensing. But what's the enforcement on trade secrets, that if you used someone else's trade secret, what would happen?
Okay, so I will answer that, but I'll just correct one thing just so everyone's clear. So if I want to enforce my patent, right, a patent is a private right. It is granted by the government, but if I want to enforce it, like I have a patent, I personally, if I own it or my company goes and sues someone. But yeah, it is a very direct right? If you just happen, for example, we're looking at a CRISPR patent here. If I own this and you do what's in these claims, right, then I can come sue you. Trade secret is different, you're right. So trade secret, you don't register your trade secrets, you just keep them secret, right? That's why they're called secrets. But you can't sue someone just for doing the same thing if they discover it independently. What you can sue, what comes up in trade secret suits is what's called misappropriation. So for example, if I have a trade secret and you work for me, and then you decide to leave the company and you go start your own company and you use all my trade secrets to basically make your product, I can come sue you for trade secret misappropriation, right? Because you've taken something that didn't belong to you, right? Because you were under confidentiality as an employee with me. And that's the most common type of suit that happens with trade secrets. The most important thing, I know this sounds really silly as a trade secret, but you have to maintain it secret. And while people think that sounds silly, it is very hard for companies to enforce and be careful about those policies, right? So for example, if you start your company and you let all of your employees use their home computers, right? And then at the end, you know, someone leaves your company and you don't ask them to pretty much wipe out all the information on their computer, that you're probably going to lose that anything that was on that computer cannot be as trade secret because you didn't care enough to tell them to erase it. So it's one of those things that can be really powerful, like the Coca-Cola recipe, but you got to be pretty good at protecting it. I saw another hand
Thank you.
somewhere.
Yeah, it looks like MIC BE926 has a hand raised.
Yes, I have a comment and a quick question, if it's possible. Question about trademark and patent. I know that trademark is like it doesn't have expiration date. Why company try to do the patent instead of making directly to trademark?
Okay, so trademark is a branding function, right? So the whole idea of trademark is so that consumers or whoever your buyer is associates your product with your company, right? And there's not confusion, right? Like, I don't think that, like, for example, IBM makes the iPhone or something. Okay, it does not protect the functionality. So for example, we'll take the iPhone, just even though it's not life sciences. So if I have a patent on the iPhone, right, it's probably about how the iPhone works, right? Some part of how that phone works. Or maybe I should go back to the drug context, right? I have a patent on a drug. It's the chemical structure of the drug. When you patent it, you don't patent just that exact structure. You patent around the drug structure and variations. And then if I'm another competitor and I make a variation of your structure that falls within your patent claims, you can still prevent me from competing with you if you have that patent. Whereas trademark, the only thing you can stop me doing is literally labeling my product with that name. If I call it a different name, but it's the same product, the trademark has no value, right? So if I make an iPhone and I call it the X phone, you can't sue me over trademark unless you can convince people that people get confused between the name iPhone and X phone. So yeah, so they serve different purposes, and companies should think about both, particularly consumer facing goods, even drugs, right? Because we all see, you know, go to your doctor, ask them about this particular drug. Those name associations can be very powerful branding and consumer loyalty. And patents is very much for protecting the underlying technology within the product or service.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a good lead into this slide, which is patents, right? Which you can look at, right? You can go on Google Patents. You can go, the patent office has a website. You can go look at patents. You can look them up by keyword. What they protect is what's in the end under the claims. There's literally an end at the end of the patent is something that says what is claimed is, and there are these numbered things which are called claims, and the only thing the patent protects are those issued claims, right? There might be a whole lot else written in the rest of the patent, right? For example, methods of how to make certain things, but if they don't appear in the claims, it's not, you can't enforce that aspect of your patent. So one of the things to keep in mind, and this is particularly true if you're like just going on Google Patent, is that patent applications, which are just basically exactly what it sounds, it's an application to the government to get a patent, and granted patents look very similar, but they are not one and the same, right? So a patent application gets published, right? So you can see it on the web. It's available as prior art. I mean, we'll talk about what that means, but its claims are not enforceable. If I just have an application and the patent hasn't been granted yet, I cannot go out and sue someone if they are doing something that overlaps my patent application. And it's likely that the claims that you see that we just looked at in the back of the patent are going to change before the patent is granted. And we'll talk about why that is, but that is there. And then a granted patent is when the government has issued the patent and said, yes, the claims you have are valid, and you now, can enforce them against people. Everything in the claims, right? That's where your fence is. And the way you can tell that for a US patent is that if you look at basically here, right, it says patent number, right? And if you look at the application on the left, it says pub number, meaning publication number. US patent applications are really distinctive because they always say US and then the year. So 2016 is the year it published. Whereas patents, actually, they started from 1 and now they're up to like 11 million and something. They literally just issued them in sequence. And of course, again, granted patents say patent, and patent applications say patent applications. Again, this is something, it seems simple, but even investors get confused with this. When you're looking at international applications, it gets a little more difficult. A lot of what you will see have these WO numbers. That's for the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. And anything that has a WO number is an application. It's not a granted patent. And then when they become patents, they have two things. They get the letter B for boy at the end, not really for boy, but just so you know what letter I'm saying. That B designates an issued patent, A designates an application, and then they get a country number. So this is a European granted patent. There are, if I get a patent in China, it has a CN number for China. All right, so there is a timeline to this, and this timeline becomes really important for startup companies. So when when you're a researcher sitting at university and you've decided you want to patent something, and you're going to go to the technology transfer office and have a chat with them about patenting, provided that you haven't previously published what you want to patent, they're going to work with you on what's called a provisional application. And a provisional application is just the first application you file in the US. In different countries, this works a little different, but since we're sitting in the US, we're going to talk about the US today. And for reference, we're just going to call this time equals 0, T equals 0. So you file this provisional application, right, on your idea. You describe it fully. You might give some examples of experiments you've done to show, for example, that your antibody binds a cell or the drug has some effect on the disease that you're interested in. And then you have 12 months before you're going to file kind of what some people might refer to as the real application, which is either what's called a PCT, which stands for Patent Cooperation Treaty application, or you can just file a US application for a US patent. The difference being that if you file this PCT, you're basically filing an application that allows you to go from the PCT to quite a number of countries in the world, not all, but about 150. Think of it like the Common College application for patents. You apply this PCT, and then later on, you choose which countries you want to go to. If you only wanted a patent in the US, you could just file directly in the US. So that takes place. You have 12 months to do that. You can't do it longer than 12 months. You can do it shorter. The reason this 12 months is important is between this 0 time point and 12 months, you can add more data to your application and more, you can kind of round it out more with more experiments. And, maybe you originally thought that only this one antibody worked for a particular purpose. Now you have a whole family of antibodies. Or maybe you took your antibody and switched the FC regions. Or on your medical device, maybe you thought that only, you could have a valve positioned in one place, and then you later find out you can actually position it in several places. And so you can add that data over the 12 months. When you get into month 12, that sort of window of opportunity closes. You can't add any more data. At that point, the application is fixed and it gets submitted again as the PCT. 6 months later, at T equals 18 months, right? We're counting from T equals 0, it publishes. So now everyone can see what you put in your application. Keep that in mind. If you don't want people to see what's in there, you probably are not going to file a patent application. There are ways of having it not published, but they definitely curtail your rights. So for the most part, let's just take this is what happens. And then after your application publishes, 12 months later, you file what's called national phase. This is where you take your PCT application and you pick the individual countries you want to file in. And here is where the expensive part comes for startups, because you have to pay fees in each of those countries. So if I want to, for example, file in Japan, my application needs to be translated into Japanese, and I have to pay the Japanese patent office for that filing, right? And then if I want to file, let's say in, somewhere in Europe, Europe is actually considered one country for purposes of this national phase stage. You can stay in English, but you're still paying the European Patent Office. If you file, for example, in Brazil, it gets translated into Portuguese and so on and so forth. And then after you do this national filing, it could be anywhere from 1 to 5 years or more before you actually get a granted patent in each of the countries, and each country operates independently. So you might get your US patent, let's say in 2 or 3 years, and you might not get a patent in China for 5 years, right? And you're managing all that together, and you're paying attorney's fees through all this. So this is where startups and their IP strategy need to raise a lot of money, right? Because this becomes expensive really quickly. And usually if they're at the university, right, the university will file this provisional. It will often file a PCT application if it thinks the technology is worthwhile. When it gets up to national phase, if there are no takers, meaning no one's licensing this technology, they might only file in the US at that point, not pick other countries, or maybe US, Europe. Whereas if they have interest from companies, whether it's a startup or a bigger company, they might pay quite a number of for quite a number of countries, because whoever's going to license it, whatever entity that is going to pay back the cost to the university. And then in some cases, the university will continue managing, this country-specific examination if a company hasn't taken control of it. And I have a number of startups where they work closely with the university, where they've licensed technology and work together in this phase where the patent is going through its examination from the government. All right, any questions on that timeline before we move on to some more details? Okay, and Charles and Rupa, like when it's time for me to wind this down, let me know.
Erica, I have a short presentation, so you can go as long as you want.
Well, at some point I'll have to leave for the airport, so don't worry, we're not getting our sleeping bags. But yeah, I don't think there's much more on this. I'm going to cover this super briefly because it's actually like a huge concept, and we could spend literally a lecture on each one of these, which we're not. But when you put in a patent application, there are certain requirements to go from an application to getting granted patent claims. And they basically, the biggest ones are, is it novel? I mean, has someone published this before? Have they done it before? You can't patent something that's already out there. So like I said, if you already, for example, there's already the Humira drug, I can't like run to the patent office and patent the same drug, right? Because it's out there. You have to find something new. Now, it doesn't have to be 100% new. If I improve upon something, like say I have a drug and I realize if I change the chemical structure, tweak it, that it's now like much more soluble, or it's much more effective, or the safety profile improves, that may be patentable. That may be novel enough. The next hurdle is called non-obviousness, right? Is it similar, so similar to something that came before that it's not really much of an innovation? For example, if I have a coffee mug and it's red and I just paint the coffee mug blue, probably not going to get a patent. But if the blue color somehow changes the properties of the mug and suddenly it can hold hot coffee way longer than the red mug, you might get somewhere. And then there are requirements for fully describing your innovation and what's called enablement, teaching other people how to make and use the invention within the patent application. And we touched on before that there's some subject matter you can patent and some you can't. In the US, we talked about natural products and abstract concepts not being patentable. In some countries, methods of treatment are not patentable. For example, in India, you cannot patent a method of medical treatment. That just is not done. It's just, they don't consider that to be fair game for patents. In Europe, you can patent a method of treatment, but you can't call it a method of treatment. You have to patent the use of a compound for treating a disease or condition. And while that somewhat works the same as a method of treatment, it does change things up a bit. So again, depending on what territories you want your technology to be protected in, you'll have to think about whether it's patentable or not in those territories. Okay, one more thing that may be of help when you're thinking in your teams about what is patentable, what can be protected, is you're not just necessarily going to file one patent. There's sort of layers. So I've done this for a drug, but you could do the same thing for a medical device or a diagnostic test. You basically start with some core innovation, right? It might be the active ingredient of a drug, like a new chemical compound. And that is one set of patent claims. Then there's that formulation, right? To make it into a pharmaceutical, for example, that you could deliver by IV or by injection or by inhalation. Methods of making, that's manufacture. That could be manufacture the active ingredients or the formulation or both, that you might patent, you might keep trade secret. Methods of use would be like methods of treatment for a drug or for a diagnostic. It would be use of this test, for example, to diagnose COVID, or use of the test, for example, that works on saliva or blood or urine. And then there are specific applications and combinations, right? You can get into very specifics about diseases and how you treat that disease. For example, your cancer drug for head and neck cancer, you might give it at a certain frequency and a certain dose. But if you treat esophageal cancer, you might actually change the dose and how often that drug is given. Or you might use it in combination with another drug or device. For example, if you were delivering something, I have a startup that works on photoimmunotherapy, right? So when you deliver light to the surface, like for a skin tumor, it's very different than if you were trying to deliver light into, for example, the esophagus, right? Because you need a catheter for that. So again, many different ways of protecting your product, and you don't need to file all these patents at once. You might kind of build this, as I call it, the egg over time. I'm probably going to skip over this only just to say that claims have kind of, you can have really broad claims, like all antibodies that bind a particular target, or you can have super narrow claims, like an amino acid sequence for the full-length antibody, right? That only protects that particular antibody. And again, this in itself could be a whole lecture, so we'll kind of just skim by this. I am going to provide these slides to folks if you do want them. I will send them to Nate to distribute. This is actually my last slide, but it's sort of the most important one I tell my clients, right? So when whether it's your research and you're trying to figure out how to get it translate it from university into commercialization, right? Whether you commercialize it or you get another company interested to commercialize it. Whether you're starting a company on your own or with a bunch of folks, I would say you're the bus driver. You have to steer the steering wheel, right? Because if you don't, it's unlikely anyone's going to do that for you. And so one of the main things you got to do is ask a lot of questions, right? Because there's a lot of things in taking research from an academic setting and getting it all the way to commercialization. Just in the IP space, there's a ton of questions, but I will tell you outside of that, obviously regulatory, business, just running a company day to day, having been in industry for like about 8 years before I went to law school, there's a lot that goes on and there's a lot to learn, and it's super cool and super fun, but yeah. So that is about it, other than, like I said, I'm happy to distribute these slides. This is me. If you do want to reach out, I am best reached by email. I don't answer my phone because it's always some random ad that I cannot understand. And I do have a website, and I am telling you that because it does have a number of blogs on it. They're getting sort of old because I have not basically blogged during COVID, which I can't explain why. It must be a psychological block. But anyway, feel free to avail yourself of that. And with that, happy to take more questions or turn it over to Rupa and let her have a turn.
Hi, Erica.
Hey.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I think it was really informative. I have a question concerning when to, like, let's say like I have like a formulation and a method of manufacturing, right? What are some factors that should go into my thinking when deciding to keep it as a trade secret or as a patent? Like,
Sure. You know,
what
it's
is
really good
the,
question.
yeah.
Really good.
Yeah.
So here's my basic rule of thumb. If you put your product out there, right, on the market, and someone can figure it out by reverse engineering, right? They take it home, they take it into their lab, they figure out how it's put together. So for a formulation, for example, if I ran it over an HPLC and put it through a mass spec, could I figure out what's in there? If the answer is yes, then patents are the better way, right? It's not a trade secret because I can figure it out and then go do it myself. If you work in food science, and I have a number of clients that do, you got to put it on the package label. Not going to make a good trade secret if you got to list out the ingredients, unless there's
True.
something about it, you know, you couldn't figure out. On the other hand, methods of manufacture, that's a tougher one, right? Because on one sense, like I said, you can't like run into someone's factory and see if they're doing the same thing. So if the manufacturing process doesn't leave any sort of telltale signs on the product, right? And you could manufacture, let's say, in 3 different ways, how would you know they were using your way and not the other 2 ways? But I'm going to stop there because there are reasons to file
progress against the aims and milestones. Now, these were the pipelines, and I believe Charles showed them last week for therapeutics, diagnostics, medical devices, digital health. And the Catalyst projects typically involve some portion of this. They don't cover the entire pipeline. For example, in a therapeutic, it may be, or with a medical device, it may be, and in what timeline would you deliver it? So if your scope increases, your cost could increase, your schedule could increase. Or if you want to decrease the cost, you may have to decrease the scope of the project. So these are all considerations, how these 3 are interrelated. Then the question is, why do we need project management? It helps keep focused on the project goals and aims. And by developing a project plan, you think in advance of the plan. For example, both the plan, what are the risks, how will you manage the risks, how will you communicate? And then you can track the progress of the project against the plan, and it improves the chances of achieving the goals. And then even because any project, you may need to pivot, you may need to change because of the results, but then it is a defined process of why you're changing, why you're pivoting. It's like when you don't know where you're going, you can go anywhere, right? So it's good to have a project plan. So for example, let's take like climbing Mount Everest. Now the goal would be to get to Everest, but you have to do it in stages, right? You'll have to go to base camp, you'll have to go to the Hillary step, to different camps along the way. Similarly, with say a Catalyst project, you have the milestone, the final aim of the project, but you'd have milestones along the way, along with the associated schedule and budget. For example, you could say achieve compounds with affinity for target kinase in low micromolar range and desired selectivity over other kinase targets. Then another aim may be preclinical studies. So, and then, for example, here is some example, like for a therapeutic example and a medical device example, like medchem, structure activity relationship, in vitro, in vivo. So it's like, what is the timeline? What is the activity, as well as what is the budget? And similarly for a medical device, could be prototyping and bench testing, in vivo. And then you have different milestones. The milestones are the diamonds. like hit identification, lead identification, or prototype version 1. Now, in terms of project, as I said about the monitoring, first the project, you have the plan for the project, which is the detailed plan, including the cost, the scope of work, the schedule, or the Gantt chart. Then as the project progresses, you monitor the project against the plan, and you monitor not only on cost, scope, schedule, but you also look at risks. Are any of the risks likely to come up? How are they being managed? And then you compare the project plan versus what the actual project is. And then you may need to take actions. You may need to pivot. You may need to replan. And if there are deviations, what is happening and to readjust. So it is a continuous loop. And so this is what I was talking about, tracking the project progress, the actual project progress versus the project plan, aims versus what has been achieved in a given time, and milestones to be reached with the given aims versus have those milestones actually been reached. And again, budget to reach milestones versus the actual budget spent to reach the milestones. And as an example, like we have proposed, this is the plan, but actually the timeline is being extended. So the schedule got extended. There could have been delays in setting up, starting, or it took longer to run. Or in this case, for example, the prototype and bench testing may have gone quicker than was expected. And this is an example of a Gantt chart, and the bars are just the tracking like the amount of the activities completed. And for Gantt charts, you can use MS Project. At UCSF, if you get a license, you can use Smart Sheets. And again, just as a recap, for the project management, there's the cost, scope, schedule, that triangle, goals of the project, the aims, the milestones, and then always monitoring and tracking a project, the plan versus the progress, the actual project versus what was planned, and monitoring and tracking that. And then I'll leave you with this cartoon, and any questions y'all have, please ask. So I cannot see the chat window. So Nate or someone, if there are any questions.
Hi, Rupa. I don't see any questions in the chat right now.
Okay, is there anything else on project management that you all want me to touch on? I can just.
Hi, Rupa.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I have a question about evaluating the feasibility of a project. Like, should this come as soon as possible before the project even gets started, or should this be something that we do along the way and reassess whether if the project is even feasible?
I would comment, and then I'd also let Charles come in. See, there are two things. One is, say, in industry, in pharma, whether a project is feasible, it'll depend on a number of things. For example, do you have a competitive, which is part of your target product profile? What is the competitive landscape? Is there an unmet need? What is the market size? And then is the project doable? But so there are a number of things to look at before you even proceed with the project. But then as the project proceeds, maybe you think, okay, I will get this lead which has these properties. But in the meantime, maybe someone publishes, there is some competition out there that makes your project less attractive. Or there could be something like you think that your clinical trial will go in a particular way. And say your phase 2 clinical trial is not showing the efficacy that you expect. And so you may not go into a phase 3 clinical trial. So it is both planning in the beginning, but as the project goes, you also have to see that there are decision points on go, no go decision points based on what your results are. And that could be even put into the project plan, that you will have these stage gates. And if you get this efficacy, say in this, at this stage, we'll go forward, but versus the safety profile. And if not, we will not go forward. Or if we can manufacture it in within this level cost, then we will consider it. And if not, we may not consider. So there are stage gates, or the stage gates that like a competitor suddenly comes up that you're not aware of. And Charles, if you have anything to add to that?
No, I thought that was I thought that was a great answer. I guess the one thing, John, is there's that cliche about throwing good money after bad. And in biotech and pharma, there's this fail fast, fail early, whatever it is. And the idea is that it's easy for managers to start, for people to start projects. It's really hard for people to stop projects. And for people that have that ability to decide to stop, as hard as it is, because people are invested or they're in love with their project or they started, all this, it just turns out that in the real world, stopping things is as important or can be more important than starting things. And it can be very sort of pull at your heart. I mean, it can be very difficult, but it's really important in the commercial sector to be more objective and less emotionally attached, even though I think when people get emotionally attached to their projects, the projects go better because they love their project. So it's a great question. I mean, with respect to feasibility and think of the opposite, which is you hit a little bump in the road and you bail. It's like, oh my God, that was really easy to surmount or get around that. So it's a great question, and I don't really know the answer. Rupa's answer was much better than mine. Thanks.
Yeah, like I've been researching in the industry space for about 3 years, and like just out of college, and I noticed that there's like pessimistic scientists and optimistic scientists, and then it's like it really bleeds into the early preclinical research, whether the scientist believes it's going to work or not.
And I think you need to also there are a lot of things you have to consider. For example, if it is a drug project, is there any human genetic evidence? Are your preclinical models really, sorry, I don't know why I've stopped. Okay, somehow I stopped share, but if we can put the slides up. In the preclinical, are your models really realistic for the human things? Like there's some diseases where there's been a lot of, I think there's some echo going on, where there's a lot of, what do you say, like in Alzheimer's, there's notorious level of failure because you haven't really had your preclinical models really recapitulate what could be. And so it again depends, versus in some diseases, your preclinical models are quite good.
I see. So the preclinical models are really essential for assessing the feasibility in an objective manner.
If the preclinical models are good, there's all kinds of things, and whether you should,
I see. All right. Thank
Charles,
you very
if
much.
you wanted to add something.
No, I was gonna add one thing. I was, like I mentioned a month ago or last month, one of the key features of these target product profiles is to sort of formalize these hurdles or challenges that have to be surmounted. And if there is something, really key, like this drug really has to be in a pill, it really cannot be injected, and you realize there's no way we can create this into an orally bioavailable manner, then you really have to have the gumption to stop the project, because if it absolutely cannot be an intravenous route of administration, well, it would be a mistake to continue to pursue that. And so one of the things this TPP does is it kind of like, in a disinterested manner, sets up minimal hurdles or minimal gates that you have to surmount to get to the next step. And so it's sort of, to your word feasibility, it's sort of like affirming or confirming that, this is still feasible. We still have a chance. We still have a chance of going. And then, like Rupa alluded to, if for some reason something goes much better than you expected and your timelines, shortened, or your potential market is widened, that's good too. And you would adjust your TPP to say, oh, we're more optimistic, we're more ambitious, we're going to have, twice the market we thought we were before. So it's just sort of a planning tool to ensure things that were feasible, still are feasible.
And also in your target product profile, you also have certain things where your minimal requirements and your ideal requirements. So you have those two criteria. Any other questions?
Okay, so I want to thank Erica and Rupa again. They both gave, I thought, really great talks, and I got a lot out of both of them. But I really want to thank all of you, everyone that's on this call that dialed in. And I was about to say, oh yeah, we're giving you 20 minutes back of your day, but none of us are getting paid now anyway, because it's after 5. So I just want to thank you all for joining. And the third workshop is about a month. It's next month about the same time. I mean, I see it. It's actually a month from yesterday. So it's Tuesday, the 17th, and it's going to be focused on entrepreneurship, which Jenny Jancy here on the call is going to give, and company formation and the legal aspects around all aspects of company formation that James Huey is going to give, that Erica mentioned. Her husband actually works in the same group as James Huey. So I'm looking forward to next month. And if I don't see some of you I know I'm going to see tomorrow, but if I don't see the rest of you until next month, I'll see